regard to justification, they would say that initial justification, the declaration that we're right with God, is by faith alone apart from works. They're very emphatic about this. But final justification is by God-produced works. Salvation itself, it's not an event, it's a process. Alan Stanley in his book will call it a pilgrimage. Don't have that in the book up here, but Thomas Schreiner calls it we should view salvation holistically. And the problem with many evangelicals is they have tended to view it as an event instead of a process occurring over a lifetime. Hence, when we're saved by faith alone, yes, faith persisting over a lifetime and producing works, because salvation is a process extending over the life. So it has to be viewed holistically. Rewards. Rewards are obtained by God-produced works, but they refer to obtaining heaven. You go through all of the passages that most of us would associate with the judgment seat of Christ. They would relate them all to the great white throne judgment and refer to the admission or rejection that Jesus prescribes regarding one's eternal destiny. So those are four basic commonalities of what I'm calling the Neo-Nomian view. Now, who are these guys? Well, okay, a word about assurance. Assurance is based on the promises of God, evidence in the life, but it's postponed to the final hour because salvation is a process, and it's only persistent faith and endurance that saves, and one, unfortunately, cannot know if he will persist until he has. So this logically results in no reliable certainty that I'm saved now. Well, who are these gentlemen? Robert Sugenis wrote a book called Not by Faith Alone. Sugenis is president of the Catholic Apologetics International. He was born Catholic, later became Reformed, went to Westminster Seminary, and then rejected the Reformed faith and came back to Catholicism. And he defends a viewpoint that's very similar to what these evangelical writers are saying in his book. A book that many of you have probably heard of is written by Thomas Schreiner and Ardell Kennedy, The Race Set Before Us. These two men are professors. In fact, Schreiner is a professor at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's written an excellent commentary on the book of Romans. Well, it's excellent, but probably a lot of us would have some questions about some of his interpretations, but nevertheless, it's a good commentary. And he's written a very good book. It's very well researched, very good spirit. Paul Rainbow, The Way of Salvation in Christian Obedience. Paul has lectured at North American Baptist Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota since 1988. He's an evangelical, but he's also a member of the Catholic Biblical Association. You can see that a lot of these writers are embracing at least some aspects of Roman theology. This one is one of the most radical, Chris Van Landingham, Judgment and Justification in Early Judaism and the Apostle Paul. Van Landingham is the assistant professor of ancient history, or was, at Oral Roberts University, solid evangelical at one point. And he is currently an adjunct professor at St. Gregory's University. They're both in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Somewhere along the line, you may hear this described as the federal vision. This is a movement within the Reformed Church to revise or update or modernize covenant theology. Hence, it's a new vision for federal theology. They deny standard of the Reformed faith, which is a limited atonement. Auburn Avenue theology, you might hear it by this name, because a series of seminal meetings were held there. And then Shepherdism is one of the most prominent writers on this particular viewpoint. But the person we're going to talk about this morning is Alan Stanley. He's recently published a book, Did Jesus Teach Salvation by Works? The Role of Works in Salvation in the Synoptic Gospels. Alan is a PhD graduate from Dallas Seminary. I think it was 2002. This book is a result, or it really is his PhD dissertation. It was published by as an Evangelical Theological Society monograph. It is very well researched. One thing you cannot accuse him of is not covering his bases. One of his interlocutors is the Free Grace movement, and on a number of occasions he is interacting with the viewpoints of Zane Hodges and Bob Wilkin and a few others, myself included. For the most part, he's done a good job of understanding what the Free Grace viewpoint is about. He's very gracious. He writes it in a ironic manner. And if you want a good book that summarizes this viewpoint, this is one of the best that I've found. But he does conclude that Jesus teaches salvation by works. Very surprising that an evangelical scholar, particularly from that institution, would do that. His book raises 5 key questions that we're going to drill down on this morning. The first is, what does it mean to enter the kingdom? We've already alluded to the fact that it seems to be predicated or conditioned upon works in the 9 instances that the phrase is used in the New Testament. The second issue is endurance required? Stanley says yes, and he goes to Matthew 10. He who endures to the end will be saved. And he understands salvation there as personal salvation from sin. Well, are the works of the believer meritorious? Stanley, in the tradition of Westminster Calvinism, says absolutely not. As we'll discuss this in a moment, I strongly disagree with him. Works of the believer are meritorious for rewards, but not for salvation. Is justification instantaneous and complete? This is a critical question, because if it is, Stanley's whole thesis and the Neo-nomian thesis is nullified. So we want to look very precisely at that. Stanley would say, well, yeah, initial justification is, but final justification is not. And you get lost in a sea of ambiguity trying to get your head around these distinctions. And then, can a believer have assurance of salvation? Although Stanley has extensive discussions in his book of salvation, the bottom line is he admits salvation is postponed to the final hour, because no one can be sure until the final hour that he has in fact produced enough works to qualify him for entrance into the kingdom. Okay, let's pick up these questions briefly. First question is, what does it mean to enter the kingdom? Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." I think for evangelicals to lean on the fact that the surpassing righteousness is the imputed righteousness of Christ is to lean on a broken reed. The context, to me, is clearly defining this righteousness in terms of the 6 antitheses which follow. You have heard it said, but I say unto you, etc. And the righteousness, in fact, in Matthew throughout, is ethical. It's behavior. It's lifestyle. So it does seem to me that if we're going to be fair to the text, we've got to acknowledge that the Neo-Nomians are absolutely correct here, that a surpassing ethical lifestyle is a condition of entering the kingdom. But there's another verse. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter. See, future tense again. But he who does the will of my Father. Now again, I understand that could refer to believing in Christ. That could be the will of Father, going to the passage in John. However, in the context of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, the will of the Father, it seems to me, is clearly an ethical lifestyle. It's living out the principles of the sermon.